To began not with a declaration of war, but with a spreadsheet. In the sterile corridors of power in Ottawa, a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, a man more accustomed to the trading floors of London and the hushed urgency of central banking, initiated a review of a dormant file. The file, buried for decades, detailed Canada's financial contributions to the NATO Support and Procurement Agency, NSPA. This is the organization that functions as the alliance's logistical backbone, its war bank, managing everything from fuel supplies to the procurement of precision munitions. What the review allegedly uncovered has sent shockwaves through the intelligence communities of Washington and Brussels, suggesting a clandestine effort by Ottawa to leverage its financial standing to effectively control the alliance's purse strings, a move that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The trigger for this seismic shift, sources close to the Prime Minister's office suggest, was not a sudden surge of expansionism, but sheer survival instinct. The return of Donald Trump to the White House brought with it a lexicon of existential threats previously unthinkable between the United States and its northern neighbor. His repeated and seemingly serious musings about annexing Canada as the 51st state were coupled with an aggressive trade war and a demand that NATO allies, particularly the laggards like Canada, dramatically increase defense spending to 5% of their GDP. For Ottawa, the writing was on the wall. The old relationship, built on decades of integrated defense and trust, was over. The hegemon had become the primary threat, forcing a desperate search for leverage. For decades, Canada has been the quintessential free rider in the transatlantic alliance, spending barely 1.37% of its GDP on defense and relying on the American military umbrella for its security. Its armed forces are a shadow of their former selves, with a critical shortage of 16,000 regular soldiers and an aging, often unserviceable fleet of aircraft and ships. This military irrelevance, however, masked a sophisticated financial and diplomatic apparatus. Carney, a former Goldman Sachs banker and governor of two G7 central banks, understood that in the modern era, power flows not just from the barrel of a gun, but from the stroke of a pen and the control of capital. The strategy, as pieced together from policy briefs and off-the-record briefings with Canadian and European officials, is audacious. Prime Minister Carney, in a whirlwind of diplomatic activity, pledged to not only meet NATO's old 2% spending target by 2026, but also committed to the new, staggering 5% target over the next decade. This represents an astronomical sum, approximately $150 billion Canadian dollars annually, that would triple the annual Canada health transfer. The immediate reaction in Washington was one of triumph. Trump had finally broken the Canadian piggy bank, but the victory lap was premature. The fine print revealed a catch. A significant portion of this new spending would be earmarked for European and Canadian defense industries, effectively bypassing the traditional dominance of American military contractors. This is where the alleged secret move concerning the NSPA comes into sharp focus. By massively increasing its financial contribution and earmarking funds for European-led procurement projects, Canada is positioning itself as an indispensable financial pillar of the alliance. It is a classic Trojan horse strategy. Unable to compete with American hard power, Ottawa is buying influence and potentially voting rights within the alliance's financial committees. Sources suggest that Canada is quietly rallying a coalition of smaller European nations, the so-called middle powers, to reform the NSPA's governance, diluting the overwhelming influence the United States has historically wielded over its funding and strategic direction. The intellectual architect of this pushback appears to be Carney himself. In a seminal speech in Davos in early 2026, he laid out a stark vision for the world's middle powers, warning them that if they were not at the table, they are on the menu. He argued that bilateral negotiations with a hegemon like the US are a negotiation from weakness. The solution, he proposed, was variable geometry, forming issue-specific coalitions to pool sovereignty and resist coercion. This was not merely aspirational rhetoric. It was a declaration of intent. Canada, he signaled, would no longer be a passive subject of great power politics, but an active shaper of a new multipolar order, even if that meant challenging the very foundations of its most critical alliance. For Washington, the panic is palpable, though carefully concealed behind official statements of support for a more capable Canada. The fear is not that Canada will march on Washington, but that it will become a disruptive force within the very institutions the US, built to project its power. A Canadian-led faction within NATO's procurement arm could prioritize European defense systems over American ones, fracture the alliance's cherished interoperability, and create a two-tiered structure where the US provides the nuclear umbrella, but Europeans and Canadians reap the industrial benefits. It would be the ultimate irony. Trump's bullying to extract more defense spending from allies could result in the creation of a European-dominated defense industrial complex that directly competes with and undermines American primacy. This strategy is not without its colossal domestic risks. Funding this 5% commitment will require considerations about what less the federal government can do, as Carney himself has ominously hinted. Economists project that meeting the target could cost well into the trillions over a decade, demanding either crippling tax increases, massive borrowing, or the gutting of cherished social programs like healthcare and the Canada Child Benefit. The Canadian public, polls show, is deeply divided on this, with only about a third supporting such a massive reallocation of national wealth towards the military, especially when the primary perceived threat is no longer a distant Russia, but their own neighbour to the south. The internal contradictions are further exposed by the state of the Canadian armed forces themselves. The government is committing to a 5% spending target when it currently lacks the personnel to operate the equipment it already has. The Canadian military is in a state of crisis, with its air and naval fleets reporting readiness rates below 50%. Pouring billions into new ships and jets from Europe makes for a good headline, but without the tens of thousands of new soldiers, sailors, and aviators to crew them, and the decades it takes to train them, this military awakening risks being an expensive illusion. A Potemkin village of defense spending that impresses NATO accountants but offers little real-world combat capability. And what of the United States' reaction? Trump has already responded to Carney's Davos speech with characteristic disdain, repeating his false claim that the US subsidizes Canada to the tune of $200 billion a year, a figure that includes both the modest goods trade deficit and a fantastical calculation of US military protection costs. His administration has a history of conflating trade and security, using tariffs as a weapon to enforce compliance. If Washington perceives Ottawa's NSPA maneuvering as an act of financial warfare, the retaliation could be swift and severe: the withdrawal of intelligence-sharing agreements, the suspension of critical NORAD cooperation, or even the explicit threat to abandon the NATO Article 5 guarantee for a country that is actively working to undermine US influence within the alliance. Yet, for the European members of NATO, Canada's gambit is a welcome lifeline. They have long chafed under American dominance of the alliance's strategic direction. A Canada willing to invest heavily in European-led projects and champion a more autonomous European pillar within NATO is a powerful ally. It provides political cover for Germany and France to further their own ambitions for strategic autonomy without being solely blamed for fracturing the alliance. The standing ovation Carney received in Davos was not just for the eloquence of his speech, but for his willingness to lead a charge that many European leaders have wanted to mount for years but lacked the courage to initiate. Looking forward, the next 12 months will be critical. The Trump shock has accelerated a realignment that was already underway. We are witnessing the unraveling of the post-1945 security architecture, where a US-dominated NATO was the undisputed guarantor of Western security. Canada's alleged move on the NSPA is a symptom of a larger disease: the death of the assumption that American and Allied interests are one and the same. If Canada succeeds, it will have fundamentally rewritten the rules of the alliance, proving that financial capital can be as potent a weapon as military capital. It will have established a precedent for coalitions of the willing within NATO that operate outside of direct US command. If Canada fails, if its economy buckles under the weight of the new spending, if its military remains a hollow force, or if Washington moves to crush this insurrection, the consequences will be equally profound. It will demonstrate that the era of unipolar American power is not yet over, and that any challenge will be met with overwhelming economic and political force. For Canadians, it would be a bitter confirmation that their sovereignty is indeed a performance, subject to the whims of a mercurial superpower. In the final analysis, what is unfolding is a high-stakes drama of survival and brinkmanship. Canada, facing an existential threat from its closest ally, is attempting the diplomatic equivalent of jiu-jitsu, using the weight of its adversary's demands to flip the balance of power. It is a dangerous game, one that risks the total collapse of a historically fruitful relationship. But as one senior Canadian official was overheard saying in The Hague, when your friend starts measuring you for a coffin, you stop worrying about hurting his feelings and start looking for a way to lock the door. The secret move on NATO's war bank, whether real or merely a brilliantly executed bluff, has served its purpose. It has announced that Canada will no longer be a passive observer of its own fate. And in the new brutal world order Trump has ushered in, that assertion of agency may be the only true defense a middle power has left.